Okay, so I'm going to start uh, this second lecture of week 2 um, with book 7. Remember, we left off book 6 with Odysseus as a guest in the palace of King Alcinous uh, of the Phaeacians. And book 7 introduces us to Odysseus as a guest in the palace. Book 8 then introduces the feast, um, and book 9 begins with, or recounts, all of book 9 recounts the story of Odysseus, that Odysseus himself tells about his encounter with the Cyclops. There's a pattern in each of these books. Book 7, we find Odysseus in need, contrasted with the Phaeacians' tremendous wealth. Book 8, we find Demodocus the singer, who is singing the stories, entertaining the people. His storytelling is something that he earns his bread by, but it's not something that he has actually endured. So he tells stories, mostly sad stories, stories of suffering, but he has not suffered them. Odysseus is actually a sufferer, has actually experienced the suffering firsthand. So that contrast between the singer singing the suffering that he's not experienced and Odysseus enduring suffering is the contrast in book 8. And then in book 9, we have Odysseus as a guest in the house of the Cyclops. Book 9 is probably the most well-known and clearly the most interesting book in the entire poem, so I'll spend a good deal of time on that. But just briefly, book 7, the palace of King Alcinous is resplendent, brilliant. The wealth has been earned by sailing, by trade. They are great shipbuilders and sailors. There was a tremendously great civilization, the Phoenicians. They would not have been, I don't think, in this area, but there is a legend, there is some historical evidence that the Phoenicians went from Asia Minor on into this would probably be the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, the far reaches of the west. I think some have even suggested it's Sicily, which is west of Italy. And there is some evidence that the Phoenicians sailed there, so there could be some historical elements to this at any rate. But their great wealth. There's one line. The feast flowed on forever there. Their great riches. It's a place that seems to be almost paradisal. See if I can find the passage. The yield of all these trees will never flag or die, neither in winter nor in summer. A harvest all year round, for the west wind always breathing through will bring some fruits to the bud and others warm to ripeness. Pear mellowing ripe on pear, apple on apple, cluster of grapes on cluster, fig crowding fig. So the luxuriousness of the island, its fruit, it's almost like a paradise. All this opulence and all this wealth is contrasted with the need of Achilles. Again, the epithet, the claim that Odysseus is the long-suffering great Odysseus. This point is made pretty clear, and so I'm just going to take a pause right here for a moment, and I'll be back. So yeah, long suffering great Odysseus um, uh, finds himself clasping the knees of Arete and Alcinous, begging for help. He says, "But as for this is at line 179. But as for myself, grant me a rapid convoy home to my own native land. How far away I've been from all my loved ones. How long I have suffered." And Alcinous and Arete, the king and queen, are deeply moved. And again, the mentioning of Zeus, right? They say, "Come, raise him up, and seat the stranger now in a silver-studded chair, and tell the heralds to mix more wine for all, so we can pour out cups to Zeus who loves the lightning. Champion suppliant's rights are sacred." So how many times have we heard this idea of Zeus and the sacredness of the guest-host relationship, and the requirement of hosts to treat guests properly. So after supper, it's only after supper that the um, king and queen ask Odysseus who he is, and Odysseus doesn't really give his name here. He he's called the man of craft, right? And he tells the story of being held on Calypso's island we find out, for 7 years. Despite the fact that he is there for 7 years, he says, "She never won the heart inside me, never." So while Odysseus might have been unfaithful to his wife, he kept his heart to himself. I guess that's the claim that he's making. What does he pass over in silence, right? He didn't really talk about his amorous relationships with her. I guess it's implied but never mentioned. The King Alcinous introduces the daughter. The idea here is that I think he would like Odysseus as a son-in-law. Odysseus does not succumb to this, but Odysseus is promised that Odysseus will be returned home the next day. All right, so preparations are made for sailing. A feast is given to honor him in Book 8. I'm going to jump right to Book 8. And we're introduced to this Book 8 is Demodocus the bard, the singer, right? And his songs at the feast. It's a kind of storytelling. And then Odysseus, remember, is actually the sufferer. So turns out Demodocus the bard, the singer, the poet, has been gifted, it says. This is at line 72 of Book 8. "In came the herald now, leading along the faithful bard, the muse adored above all others." So the muse, right, the goddess of poetry and singing, that was introduced in the invocation of the muse. The muse adores Demodocus the bard, but her gifts were mixed with good and evil both. She stripped him of sight, but gave the man the power of stirring rapturous song. So this is a very old idea. We'll encounter it with the prophet Tiresias. Tiresias is blind, but can see the future. The bard is blind, but can speak of heavenly things, and things beyond the natural realm. So this idea of blindness, of being blinded as a gift, not as something imposed, but it's a gift. It takes away physical sight, but allows the singer, and as we'll see, the prophet, to see things that go below the body, that go below the senses, or go beyond the senses, right, to what might be called the spiritual realm, or the inner realm of the human person. So the tradition has it that Homer himself was blind, was a blind poet, and the blindness gave him insight. By a very strange quirk of history, or I don't know if you could call it history, but the great poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, the English poet of the 17th century, Milton himself was blind as well, so he played into this idea of blindness and spiritual insight. So it's a long tradition of the great epic poets being blind. Virgil was not blind, by the way, who wrote the Aeneid. So the blindness of the bard allows him to see spiritual or deeper truths below or beyond the senses. What does he tell the story of? He tells the story of the strife between Odysseus and Achilles. And what's interesting is, in the telling of the story, we do not get it itself, but we only get the effect that it has on Odysseus, which is that he begins to cry. And Alcinous says, all right, we've had enough. He sees Odysseus' grief. He feels sorry for him. And he stops the bard from singing. And he calls for new entertainment, which is they start to engage in a kind of sports. There's a comic tale then at 301 to 413 that we do get a comedy between Ares and Aphrodite caught by Hephaestus. And the Phaeacians dance and give him gifts. On the second day of the feasting, Odysseus praises the bard. This is at line, I'm going to read Odysseus' praise at 532. By now they were serving out the portions, mixing wine, and the herald soon approached, leading the faithful bard Demodocus, prized by all the people, seated him in a chair amid the feasters, leaning it against the central column. At once, alert Odysseus carved a strip of loin, rich and crisp with fat, from the white tusked boar that still had much meat left, and called the herald over. Here, herald, take this choice cut to Demodocus so he can eat his fill, with warm regards from a man who knows what suffering is. Right? So Odysseus gives him a choice cut of meat from all because he recognizes Demodocus' suffering, right? The loss of the eyesight, I suppose, and the ability to sing suffering songs. From all who walk the earth, our bards deserve esteem and awe, for the Muse herself has taught them paths of song. She loves the breed of harpers. So Odysseus recognizes Demodocus' own suffering. The song that is sung, Odysseus requests it, is the song of the fall of Troy. the Demodocus, it says, narrates a tale true to life, all too true. You sing the Achaeans' fate, all they did and suffered, all they soldiered through, as if you there yourself or heard from one who was. This is said by Odysseus. And of course, Odysseus was there, so he's wondering how Demodocus has heard this tale, as though he was there, or heard from someone who was. You get the sense that Odysseus is wondering if he knows this man, or which of his comrades told the story. So we don't get Demodocus's words here, but we get an outline of the story, very brief outline for about 8 lines from 579 to 585. That story has to be told elsewhere. But the song of the famous harper is completed at 585, and Odysseus' response is told at 586. The great Odysseus melted into tears. Finally, Alcinous has had enough, and he says, "Fair is fair." This is at line 617. "Fair is fair. Speak out. Come, tell us the name they call you there at home. Your mother, father, townsmen, neighbors round about. Surely no man in the world is nameless." So 617 to 620. Surely no man in the world is nameless. This is an interesting point, because one of the things that Odysseus does to get out of a scrape is to call himself no one. So it kind of foreshadows that tale. Here's the point Alcinous makes. This is a key point he makes at the end. "But come, my friend, tell us your own story now, and tell it truly. Where have your rovings forced you? What lands of men have you seen? What sturdy towns? What men themselves? Who were wild, savage, lawless? Who were friendly to strangers, God-fearing men?" Notice the key point. Where were the barbarians? Where were the civilized people? Who treated you like a guest? Who did not? Who treated you like an enemy? Tell me, why do you weep and grieve so sorely when you hear the fate of the Argives, hear the fall of Troy? That is the gods' work, spinning threads of death through the lives of mortal men, and all to make a song for those to come. That is a key point. The whole point is the gods cause the sufferings of men. Why? So we can tell those stories. That's the point. There's something about suffering that makes us deeply human. And it's the stuff of stories themselves. Most stories are that almost all, I'd say all stories that are interesting, right, tell some aspect of suffering. You're going to tell a story about nice things all the time. That's not a story. The stories that matter are the stories that involve problems that people get out of. So that is the gods' work, spinning threads of death through the lives of mortal men, and all to make a song for those to come. So we tell the stories then. Then he goes on, "Did one of your kinsmen die before the walls of Troy? Some brave man, a son by marriage, father by marriage, next to our own blood kin, our nearest, dearest eyes, or a friend perhaps, someone close to your heart, staunch and loyal, no less dear than a brother, the brother in arms who shares our inmost thoughts." So Alcinous recognizes he's a Greek, and he was fighting in Troy. So book 9 begins with Odysseus recounting his story. He praises Demodocus, and he agrees to tell his tale. Interesting point at line 11. "But now you're set on probing the bitter pains I've borne. So I'm to weep and grieve, it seems, still more. So it's not enough to tell the story, but when you tell the story, you relive it. And in reliving it, the the pain and suffering comes back. Right? That's interesting. It's part of I would step back for a moment and think about this from a kind of modern perspective. The Greeks invent the idea of telling a story not only to relive the the what might be called trauma, right? But also in some ways to relieve oneself of the trauma. A great psychological insight is that you go back to the point of trauma and speak it, and to just speak it is therapeutic. So I don't know. This strikes me as already at the beginning of the origin of Western culture, we have this idea of a kind of therapeutic nature of storytelling. Odysseus will have to relive the tale of suffering, but what's interesting is he'll not only relive it, he'll release himself from some of the suffering, and he'll learn something about himself. I think he begins to learn something in telling the story itself about himself. He's going to have to relive it. His story is one of pain. He says, "What pains the gods have given me my share." Right? What pains the gods have given me my share. So the question becomes, what of these sufferings was given by Odysseus himself, or what of these pains and sufferings were doled out by the gods? That's a good question, and we can read his story and find that out, I think, and have a question. We can think about it and ask that question. Maybe we can try to interpret it. I don't know. So his name comes first. "I am Odysseus," he says, "son of Laertes, known to the world for every kind of craft. My fame has reached the skies. Sunny Ithaca is my home." Again, this isn't fully explicit until much later. But when he says, I'll just kind of relieve you of the mystery. The name Odysseus, Greek name Odysseus, is translated in English son of pain or son of suffering. So Odysseus, actually, his name is son of pain. So when he says, "I am Odysseus," he's saying, "I am Odysseus. I am son of pain, son of Laertes." A very interesting construction there. Known to the world for every kind of craft. So what's interesting is the son being the son of suffering. It goes hand in hand with the fact that he's crafty. He learned those crafts probably by suffering. So suffering leads to ingenuity, perhaps, and wiggling out of cleverness. So again, this is a very interesting way of announcing himself. He is son of pain. He is Odysseus. Is a very important point in this narrative. So his story of wandering comes after his description of Ithaca. He says, "No sweeter sight on earth than a man's own native country." So he tells he's Odysseus. He comes from Ithaca. That's where he's trying to get back to. He's still lost here, but I would suggest to you, in telling the tale of himself here, he will find himself again, and that will lead him on his way back home. Okay. Okay, so he begins by telling the story of the nymphs, Calypso and Circe. He said, they never won my heart, um, but very briefly, I don't think he's willing to talk about that. But now he is willing to give a long description of the voyage. The voyage fraught with hardship, Zeus inflicted on me homeward bound from Troy, he says, at 42-43. The first story is the land of the Lotus Eaters. Very briefly, the men wind up eating the food of the Lotus Eaters and wind up becoming enamored of the place, and they wind up lost in this stupor, this happy stupor. The lotus flower probably is poppy, from which poppy you make opium. But I think it means more than that. It's more symbolic than that. It's any kind of pleasure or tarrying at a place that leads you away from home, your desire to go home. They lose their desire to go home. But Odysseus is not. He drags them out. So he actually is a good leader here and does well at the beginning of this. So he tells the story then of the Cyclops. That's the next tale. Who are they? They are. Well, let me read it. They're introduced at line 20. Lawless brutes. Line 120. Lawless brutes who trust so to the everlasting gods that they never plant with their own hands or plow the soil. That's an interesting point. They trust to the gods, so they never have to plow. It's almost as though their trust in the gods is second nature. One might say they've become so used to trusting the soil and trusting the gods that they don't pay them attention. Unsown, unplowed, the earth teems with all they need, wheat, barley, and vines swelled by the rains of Zeus to yield a big, full-bodied wine from clustered grapes. So they just kind of live off this, they pluck things. Not very difficult. They have no meeting place or council, no laws either. No, up on the mountain peaks they live in arching caverns, each a law to himself, ruling his wives and children, not a care in the world for any neighbor. We should think about Ithaca and what's going on at Odysseus' own house. There has been no public council for 20 years. So the Cyclops are kind of figures of what happens when there's no civic relationships. They also have a peculiar thing. They're giants, and they have one eye in the middle of their forehead. They have no ships. This is at 138. No ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights. Right. Such artisans would have made this island too a decent place to live in. They really don't do very much. They're isolated on this island. Odysseus lands on the island and at 195 says, what are they? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? Remember that this is Odysseus telling the story to the Phaeacians. You should always keep that in mind. So he's repeating what he's heard from Alcinous. He decides to go visit the Cyclops. He goes into the house. He goes into one of the caves. He sees all the cheeses. The men say, let's steal the cheeses and leave. Odysseus says no. He wants to see he disagrees with his men. He overrules them, and he decides to stay and wait. This is the description of the lair. It is a kind of lair, this cave. You can see from the look of the place what kind of creature Cyclops is. He's a grim loner. This is at 210. He's a grim loner, dead set in his own lawless ways. Here was a piece of work by God, a monster built like no mortal who ever supped on bread. No, like a shaggy peak, I'd say, a man-mountain, rearing head and shoulders over the world. So he knows this guy is huge, a giant. But he says that he's not going to leave. Odysseus says, not till I saw him, saw what lovely gifts he'd give. Right? So Odysseus has, as we'll see, Polyphemus will violate the guest-host relationship, but Odysseus has violated it first. He goes in, tries to steal the cheese. He walks in, the guy uninvited, sits there and waits, and then presumes that the host is going to give him a gift. This is not acceptable. So the guest can violate the guest-host relationship as well by being overly demanding and claiming something as a right that is not his as a right, but only should be given as a gift. As a gift. Okay? So he seeks a gift that's not in the nature of a gift. You're actually stealing the host's ability then to be loose, who gives freely if you demand. So you see how interesting this guest-host relationship is from both sides. Odysseus clearly is in violation of it. Cyclops shows up and says this. Strangers. This is at 284. Walks in, sees them. Strangers, he thundered out. Now who are you? Where did you sail from over the running sea lanes? Out on a trading spree? Or roving the waves like pirates? Sea wolves raiding at will who risk their lives to plunder other men? The Cyclops violates the guest-host relationship, doesn't offer them food or drink, asks immediately who they are, and accuses them of being marauders. By the way, they are. They are. That's the first thing that Odysseus did when he left Troy. So he himself is a marauder, and Zeus, Cyclops seems to intuit that. So Odysseus answers Cyclops' rudeness with a rudeness of his own. They seek a guest gift, the sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. Respect the gods, my friend. We're suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred. Zeus will avenge their rights. That's at line 301 to 305. True enough. There's no doubt that Odysseus is speaking the truth. The problem is that you don't go and ask that. It's not your business as the guest to demand something and appeal to the gods, especially Zeus. And by the way, Cyclops is not the kind of person who's interested in following this. Listen to his response at 306. Stranger, he grumbled back from his brutal heart. You must be a fool, stranger, or come from nowhere. Again, that's a joke, right? Because one of the ways that Odysseus will trick the Cyclops is to claim he came from nowhere and his name is no one. Telling me to fear the gods or avoid their wrath? We Cyclops, this is funny. By the way, this is a funny story because the Cyclops is so stupid and so blind. His blindness really is self-inflicted. He's blind, so he deserves to be blinded by Odysseus. But we Cyclops never blink at Zeus and Zeus's shield of storm and thunder or any other blessed god. We've got more force by far. Right? So Cyclops is wrong there, right? But the idea that he doesn't blink out of his one eye, I mean, this is funny. To blink out of his one eye. So he doesn't fear the gods. He has far too much force. I'd never spare you in fear of Zeus's hatred. You were your comrades here, unless I had the urge. But tell me, where did you moor your sturdy ship when you arrived? Up the coast or close in? I'd just like to know. Right? He doesn't just like to know. He wants to know because he wants to destroy it. Plunge from it. Again, I want to re-emphasize this idea of the relationship of guest-host. If you do not fear the gods, you're not going to treat guests very kindly. Okay, so I just want to now think about the Cyclops is really a symbol of all people who refuse to acknowledge the guest-host relationship as hosts. They can't acknowledge the gods. Why? Well, if you have one eye, one of the things you can't see is depth. So the Cyclops with one eye sees everything flat. And that flattened vision projects the Cyclops' own desires and own wants out onto the world. Right? So if everything is flat, you're pretty much projected onto the world, and what you basically see is you become nearsighted. And therefore, anything close to you is all that matters. And then, therefore, anything that's close to you, you confine yourself to anything you can see and grab a hold of, consume. The Cyclops' one eye is a figure of the inability to see beyond one's own desires, especially one's own bodily desires. Anybody who does that is not going to pay attention to the gods, and they're not going to pay attention to anybody else. This is a kind of funny, almost allegory. One has to ask the question, is Odysseus hiding something here? Is Odysseus making up a story to mask, to articulate the guest-host relationship in a humorous, really, really interesting, enjoyable way, but in an allegory, a kind of allegory for the guest-host relationship. So that's a question one might ask. The Cyclops then, what he does is he grabs, there are 6 men with Odysseus. I'm sorry, there are 12 men with Odysseus. He grabs 2 and beats their heads in the ground and eats them. This this is a kind of a joke, right? Think about how the Cyclops has overturned the guest-host relationship. He not only is not going to feed the guests, he's going to eat his own guests. It's humorous and kind of brilliant, and that's why I almost think of it as an allegory. Odysseus wants to kill him immediately, but he overcomes his rage and doesn't kill him with his fighting heart. This is at 333. to 343. I think the contrast clearly is to the fighting at the Battle of Troy, and especially to Achilles. Achilles' rage destroyed the Greeks in many ways. His fury also destroyed the Trojans too. But if Odysseus succumbs to killing the Cyclops, he'll never get out of the cave because that great boulder is there, right? The great boulder is there, and there's no way to move it out of the cave, and they'll die of hunger because they'll not be able to move it. So they're going to have to find a way to get out when that cave, that rock is rolled away, and the only one who can roll it away is Polyphemus. We don't know his name, by the way, is Polyphemus yet, so we just know him as a Cyclops. So he plans a stratagem, and what he will do with the men's help is that he will carve out of this long stick a very sharp pointed spear. And he will then put in hot fire to make it hot, and he'll use it to poke the Cyclops' eye out. He comes back again, violates the guest host, he leaves for the day, goes back, comes back and eats 2 more men. And Odysseus offers him this strong wine that he has to happen to have taken, this black wine, at 390 or so. The full-bodied wine, he tells him, let me see if I can, I'm sorry, I'm looking for a particular line. He says, "You barbarian, how can any man on earth come visit you after this? What you've done outrages all that's right." Well, the Cyclops doesn't want visitors. That's exactly the point. But this kind of the humorous way that this is told, it's almost funny that the scenes in which the Cyclops takes the men and beats their head brains in. I don't know. I think of these as funny scenes. And so the plan here, the trickery here by Odysseus is put into play at line 408. So he says, "So you ask me the name I'm known by, Cyclops. I will tell you. But you must give me a guest gift, as you promised. Nobody. That's my name. Nobody. So my mother and father call me. All my friends." There's a hint of ironic pathos in this. The sense that everybody who knows him calls him nobody. He's been gone for 20 years. He might as well be nobody. So while this is a trick, and we'll see what the trick will be, the trick that he plays on Cyclops, plays on that word nobody, there's something of truth to this. Odysseus at this point has kind of lost his name. Why? Because he's lost his identity. He's lost his way home. Right? The Cyclops' response is, I think, funny, but he boomed back at me from his ruthless heart. "Nobody, I'll eat nobody last of all his friends. I'll eat the others first. That's my gift to you." And he falls back drunk, passes out. So this is, again, humorous, but ironic. There's a deep irony here and a deep meaning here that masks, that the comedy kind of masks or plays into, perhaps, and makes even more poignant. So um, the 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 blinding of the Cyclops here. The men take this pointed stick, big pointed stick, make it hot, and they jab the eye out. Um, and I'll just read it. I like disgusting, gross descriptions, um, and so I'll read this description to amuse myself. Um, so we seized our. This is a 533. So we seized book 9, line 4. I'm sorry, 433. So we seized our stake with its fiery tip and bored it round and round in the giant's eye till blood came boiling up around that smoking shaft, and the hot blast singed his brow and eyelids round the core, and the broiling eyeball burst, its crackling roots blazed and hissed. And now we have a simile, an epic simile. As a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe or adds an ice-cold bath and the metal screeches steam and its hard. That's the iron's strength. So the eye of the Cyclops sizzled round that stake. Gets up screaming, right? Bellowing. It's nighttime, right? The monster wrenched the spike from his eye, and out it came with a red geyser of blood. He flung it aside with frantic heads, and mad with pain, he bellowed out for help from his neighbor Cyclops, living round about in caves or windswept crags. So they come, and it's only here that we find out Cyclops' name. Cyclops never gives his name. His name is Polyphemus. So all the other Cyclops, what's going on, Polyphemus? Roaring out in the God-sent night to rob us of our sleep. Surely no one's rustling your flocks against your will. Surely no one, again, no one, the joke, no one's trying to kill you now by fraud or force. No one's trying to kill you now by fraud or force. Again, you notice the humor. It's very funny. And again, they're not coming because they care about Polyphemus. They're caring because he's interrupted their sleep, and they want to go back to bed. It's annoyance. Polyphemus' response, they don't care about each other. There's no civic community. Nobody, friends. The use of the word friends there, nobody, friends, is, I think, again, ironic and humorous. Polyphemus bellowed back from his cave, nobody's killing me now by fraud and not by force. Right? So he picks up on that fraud and force and reiterates what they said. Nobody's really doing that. If you're alone, his friends boom back at once, and nobody's trying to overpower you. Now look, it must be a plague sent here by mighty Zeus, and there's no escape from that. You'd better pray to your father, Lord Poseidon. So Odysseus' response is he's laughing about this. They lumbered off, he says, but laughter filled my heart to think how nobody's name, my great cunning stroke, had duped them one and all. But notice how he says, how nobody's name. But that's the name he gave himself. It's again a kind of ironic acknowledgement of his own loss of his own name here, his own identity. That's what's got them into this situation. So he's laughing about the fact that, almost laughing about the fact that he's lost his name. He's not taking it much seriously, very seriously. He should. He's called some of men to die. The scene here, then, he creates this way of leaving where all the men go underneath the goats, or these sheep. These sheep, they're huge sheep, so they can tie themselves underneath. And Cyclops goes out, watches them go out, and touches them, but doesn't go underneath. Touches them, but to see if they've all gone out. Touches their head, And they all leave. So it's Odysseus' cunning again that allows them their escape. Notice Odysseus is by himself and gets in under the biggest ram. The men must notice this. This is self-serving behavior. So the there's a he talks to his sheep, who it seemed to be the only creatures he really cares about. And he says, "Oh, you're the big ram. You're sad, sick at heart for your master's eye." This is around 5:05. That coward gouged out with his wicked crew, only after he'd stunned my wits with wine. That nobody who's not escaped his death, I swear not yet. Right? So he's threatening that he's going to kill him. Oh, if thought like me had words like me to tell me where that scoundrel is cringing from my rage, right? So he's talking to these dumb animals, right? They're the means of his escape, right? And he wishes they could speak because they'd be able to tell him. I'd smash him against the ground. I'd spill his brains, flooding across my cave. And that would ease my heart of the pains. That good-for-nothing nobody made me suffer. Again, the joke that nobody made him suffer. He's speaking truth. Or if anybody made him suffer, it's himself and Zeus. So, Odysseus was the one who caused it, right? Cyclops is speaking truth here. Nobody caused it but himself. It's self-inflicted in a way. He mocked Zeus, and Zeus is paying him back. So again, the humor of this and the deep-seated irony involved in all of this, the irony of all of this, how this works in terms of this joke of the name nobody. They get in their ships. Odysseus gets in their ship, and Odysseus can't stop himself. He goes to the ship, and they're off. They're in the water, and they're in the water. Hang on a second, I have to pause. So yeah, they're on the ship, and they've escaped. Cyclops is blind. He can't see anything out there. And Odysseus decides to hunt Cyclops. And he says, "So, Cyclops, no weak coward it was whose crew you bent to devour there in your vaulted cave. Your filthy crimes came down on your own head, you shameless cannibal." Odysseus is making the point, right, that he caused it himself. He brought all this down on himself. Daring to eat your guests in your own house. So Zeus and the other gods have paid you back. He can't stop. He has to tell him how this happened. So again, this is Odysseus telling the story, right? And the monster takes this huge hill, massive hill, and throws it. And it goes behind the ship. It's got good hearing, he can hear. And the ship comes almost all the way back to the shore. And the men are crazy, right? But they're worried about this. And so they're rowing. And the men say this to him. "So headstrong, why rile the beast again? That rock he flung in the sea just now, hurling our ship to shore once more. We thought we'd die on the spot." So the men are getting aggravated. Remember, this is Odysseus telling the story. If he'd caught a sound from one of us, just a moan, he would have crushed our heads in ship timbers with one heave of another flashing jagged rock. Good God, the brute can throw. So they begged, but they could not bring my fighting spirit round. I called back with another burst of anger, Cyclops, if any man on the face of the earth should ask you who blinded you, shamed you so, say Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged out your eye. Laertes' son who makes his home in Ithaca. He doesn't only tell him his name, he tells him where he's from. And it turns out that Polyphemus had a prophecy that this would happen. That prophecy years ago, he says, it all comes home to me with a vengeance. That I be blinded here at the hand of one Odysseus. But I always looked for a handsome giant man to cross my path, some fighter clad in power like armor plate. But now look what a dwarf, a spineless good for nothing, stuns me with wine, then gouges out my eye. Come here, Odysseus, let me give you a guest gift and urge Poseidon, the earthquake god, to speed you home. I am his son, and he claims to be my father, true, and he himself will heal me if he pleases. No other blessed god, no man can do the work. Odysseus' pride gets the better of him. Not only must he tell him that Zeus punished him, he has to tell him that it was him, Odysseus, from Ithaca. So it's interesting that Polyphemus, the prophecy didn't help him. He never suspected somebody smaller than him. He's too stupid to even recognize wit as capable, and he thinks he's smart. So blindness keeps you blind. A failure to learn keeps you ignorant, and so you don't even know your own ignorance. This is an interesting introduction of the idea in Greek thought of the idea of blindness and ignorance and knowledge. We'll explore this in depth in Oedipus Tyrannus, but it's present here in this poem. So Odysseus' mistake is pride and hubris. He could have gotten away with this, but now Polyphemus knows his name. He's going to pray to Poseidon, his father, and now Poseidon is going to go after Odysseus. So Zeus, Odysseus and his men offer a sacrifice to Zeus, but Odysseus says, Zeus of the thundercloud who rules the world was failed to be moved by his offerings. This is really at the end, around 6:15. Zeus, he says, was still obsessed with plans to destroy his horse-swept fleet and loyal crew of comrades. So they take off. I've reached about an hour with this lecture. It's only 3 books. They're really three very important books, especially book 9 is important. So I'm gonna stop the video here at about an hour, and the next video will take up 9 books. I think I should be able to do 9 books within an hour or a little bit over, maybe a little under an hour, maybe a little bit over an hour. But we'll stop there at the end of book 9.